Hi Bio20. Welcome to our lesson today where we will talk about 4.1 and 4.3 in one video lesson, and then we'll be back for 4.2 in a second and very last video lesson for Biology 20. So today, some terminology you may recognize, looking at how a species has a lot of variation that helps them survive changes in the environment. That is an advantage to have a lot of genetic variation in organisms, and eventually they may become adaptations if they are characteristics that are helpful to their survival. So adaptations that help them survive could be in one of these three categories. Either structural adaptations, which are basically body structures, body parts that help them survive, and it could be even color or actual structures. Second one is behavioral adaptations, like migrating or running in packs or hibernating. Those are behaviors that help them survive. Third category is physiological adaptations, so some sort of body function, enzyme, chemical, or the way the body temperature goes cold during hibernation. Those are physiological adaptations. So those are the three. Definition of a species are individuals that can interbreed to make fertile offspring. So if they can breed and make offspring that are infertile, they may be very closely related but not of the same species. So with sexual reproduction, we've got genes coming from two parents, so that leads to genetic variation, because those genes get passed from those parents with a new combination into their offspring. So the way that there could be further new combinations or new traits is by mutations, and mutations are changes to DNA or genetic material because of some mutagen that causes a change in the genetic material. So it could be UV radiation or formaldehyde, for example, or some other chemical. And sometimes the mutation may not do anything to the cell. Sometimes it may cause cell death or uncontrolled multiplication of that cell, forming like a tumor, or it may give just a change that gives that organism a new characteristic, or some variation can come because of that mutation. So mutations are sometimes not so great, and sometimes it doesn't really matter, or could be a good thing. So could be bad, could be good. If that mutation is in a body cell, that won't go anywhere. It won't be found in offspring. But if it's found in a gamete, which is a sperm or egg cell, if that change or mutation is in a sperm or egg cell, that will be passed on to future generations. So sometimes if the organisms have a change, it may not like right away be something that's an advantage. However, if their environment changes, there may be some with some mutations that suddenly have an advantage. So this is kind of how so those mutations end up down the road staying in the gene pool and being passed on to future generations, because those individuals who have that mutation suddenly have a selective advantage when the environment changed, and they may have like really long roots of a plant, or really extra thick fur, or something like that. And if they have some selective advantage because of the mutation, those will end up staying in the population. Adaptation is a very slow process, as it mentions here, and it says sometimes it will take time, but sometimes if it's little creatures like insects that reproduce very quickly, sometimes that new trait can become part of the gene pool very quickly, like when bacteria gain a resistance to antibiotics, or insects get a resistance to insecticide. Those mutations, if some insect has it, those could end up being found in offspring very quickly. The MRSA, methicillin-resistant staphylococcus, is a bacteria that had a lot of press because it was basically called the superbug, and it was antibiotic resistant. And so there's a lot of research being done on to how to find an antibiotic to treat the MRSA. Lots of videos and documentaries on this that you can check out. But basically it says to get a really good antibiotic for something, it takes over around 8 to 10 years, which is a significant amount of time, because by the time they get an antibiotic, basically those bacteria could have mutated, and then maybe the antibiotic isn't good anymore. So that is showing how a mutation could be a very tricky thing. So MRSA basically has been sometimes spread in hospitals, and very dangerous, because if someone has a low immune system and they're already in the hospital with something, and we don't have an antibiotic that will work because it's a superbug and is resistant to all the antibiotics, they can become deadly infections when you get a MRSA infection. Okay, natural selection. Now this is that concept of how when some organism has a selective advantage because it can survive the environment, they will be the ones to have babies and pass those traits on to their offspring. The environment is, if you ever have a question about this, is what provides the selective pressure of who lives and who doesn't. So the environment will definitely select for those who live and select against those who do not survive. So just remember how that terminology works. If they survive, the environment selected for them. If they don't survive, they were selected against. If they have a mutation that's helpful, they will be selected for and survive and reproduce and have babies. Alrighty. We're going to move on to 4.3, and short little thing about how new species form. And speciation is when a new species forms and it can no longer reproduce with previous species. So two pathways that speciation can happen. Number one is transformation, where little changes happen and eventually they've adapted so much that they are now have replaced the old species. So the ancestral mammoth was replaced by the steppe mammoth, which was replaced by the woolly mammoth, the most recent one. So that would be transformation. A couple cool links to check out here. The other way speciation can happen is by divergence, where we have an original species, and because they have adapted to different food, for example, they may diverge and form different species. Okay, so either it is transformation, one replaces another, or divergence, where the species today came from an original ancestral species. So the case study of the Darwin's finches is always interesting to look at, because when he went to Galapagos Islands, he found that on each island there was a different finch, but he eventually came to the conclusion that they may have started off as one original ancestral species, but because there was different food at different islands, they have all adapted to that food and become so different now. The cactus eater has a different beak than the insect eater, different beak than the woodpecker type. The plant eater type looks like this, and the one that eats seeds, nuts, has this shell. So their little beaks are different because of different available food, and so this is another example of divergent speciation. So they've come from an original species. Okay, so the ways that speciation can happen is, number one, by separation. So you can have groups that are separated long enough where mutations can happen independently to the other group. So there could be some kind of a physical barrier that separates them. geologic barrier like an island or a lava flow, or there could be a biological barrier that keeps them from breeding anymore. So something like a different courtship song. So one of those barriers can show up, and that could be enough to get them developing in different places differently. And here's another picture of what we believe the common ancestor beak looked like, and the 3, 6, 9, 10 or so finches that they have located that they believe could have come from that original one. And they even not only eat different things and have different beaks, but they live in different places. So some are ground finches and some are tree finches. Okay, so reproductive isolation is when speciation happened and they no longer can reproduce and make fertile offspring, and they have changed too much, and so now they are different species. So another case study has been done of the cichlids in Africa. There was a lot of rising and falling of Lake Victoria, and so because it rose and fell so many times, it isolated these small groups of cichlids so many times that they now have different teeth, jaws, colors, and mating behaviors, and so they may have, again, interesting little video of cichlids and how they've evolved, but they believe there's an original cichlid population. However, because these groups were separated from each other for so long, they have adapted to be so different they can no longer interbreed. Okay, and when you have one ancestral species that has diversified into several adapted species, you can also give that the name adaptive radiation. So you've got some original finch that's now ended up being a whole bunch of tree finches here, a warbler finch and a bunch of ground finches, and these eat seeds, cactus, insects, fruits. So you can see that their bills, their food are all different, and this is just another example, divergence or adaptive radiation. And last concept, guys, for this lesson is about the pace of revolution can either be something that's gradually happening in a linear pattern, and it can be sort of, as you can see here, linear, one turns into the next, or it can be punctuated equilibrium where there's periods of no change, and then it's punctuated with some speciation and change. So whenever you see like this more jagged sort of looking like depiction model of the speciation, you would call this punctuated and this one gradualism. So looking down here, you would say this one is the more gradualism type, and this is the punctuated type of model of speciation. So last thing for parts of the theory of evolution by natural selection is that life has developed from ancestral species. All things are related to each other by common descent, by varying degrees. All living things have a common ancestor, and the mechanism that one evolves is because mutations that have an advantage are more likely to allow that organism to live and have babies and pass those mutations on to the future generation. Alrighty, those are the concepts in the theory of evolution, and